Hi, everyone. This is Allison Elgart from the AG's office. I think we'll get started since it is 5 minutes after, and we may skip over. We don't have a quorum right now. We just have three board members on. So when we get one more board member, we can go back to the items that need voting. But I think for now, we may skip ahead to the DOJ update. And then if we do get a quorum, we can come back to the items of voting on the co-chair and the minutes. So with that, I will turn it over to Dominique to give you all the DOJ update.
Hey everyone, this is Dominique Alcaraz, an attorney in CRES, working with the board. And what I want to do today first is kind of give you all an update of where this section of the report is, the work that we have done on behalf of the subcommittee since we last met, and then kind of give a roadmap of what we're going to do today during the meeting and during the discussion portion of the meeting. So at our previous meeting in March, I went over sort of the different things that this board has already done and discussed in the previous reports, and we talked a little bit about state law and what requirements there are about the procedures for civilian complaints throughout the state. And a few board members suggested providing recommendations and potentially coming to a consensus on what kind of recommendations the subcommittee would like to make to move to the full board in order to write a letter similar to the letter that the board wrote to Dr. Weber regarding Penal Code 148.6. And so for those of you who may not be familiar with the letter, who were not on the board at that time, we did include that as part of the meeting materials. So you can kind of see what went in the letter and where it went. The idea here is that since the board and this subcommittee specifically for the past few years has provided best recommendations for the procedure of civilian complaint investigations, best practices for civilian complaint forms, this seems like a natural next step based on the discussions and what has already happened in the board to provide direct recommendations to the legislature on how to improve the civilian complaint investigation or intake process, all of that sort of marked together. So since we last met, we have put together this section, which hopefully folks had an opportunity to review. But the section includes similar parts that were included in the previous year's reports, which is the review of the current or the new wave of agencies that are reporting, a review of their civilian complaint forms. This year, we tried to make it a little bit more engaging than the way they were presented in the years past because it was a lot of block language, but that is included in this section. In addition to that, given the discussion that occurred at the last meeting, we went ahead and put together sort of all of the information that exists in state law regarding civilian complaint processes and procedures. And we also did outreach to the current wave of reporting agencies about their civilian complaint forms, whether or not they use some kind of EIS system and whether or not they include civilian complaints in that EIS system. So I know at the previous subcommittee meeting, Chief Swing mentioned that there were several parts of the complaint process or procedure that many agencies across the state already do that are similar to the best practices that the board has recommended in the past. And so we included those from the previous board reports. So basically most of the recommendations already in this section are the same ones that you all have already put forth as ones that are best practices and you would probably like to see as a uniform sort of process and procedure across the state. We have room in the section, of course, to receive feedback from the subcommittee if there are additional best practice recommendations. And we'll go through them in more detail in the part of the agenda where you all get to discuss the report, but I just want to give you the update now. in addition to the general sort of best practices or recommendations around the civilian complaint investigation and intake process, we also discussed the need for a definition of civilian complaint. As you all have discussed in the past and in the board reports have reported, that there is no definition for civilian complaint. The law does not state what that is, and every agency has a different definition for what is a civilian complaint and how those are categorized upon receipt. So, as the board has sort of recommended in the past, looking at making a definition that the state could use. So what we did since the last meeting was look at different agencies' definitions of civilian complaint, but we focused our efforts on looking at agencies that experts in this field have recommended to us. And I will say that with a caveat, being in this area, as far as the definition of civilian complaints, there is not necessarily one best definition that exists right now, because things vary across the state, across the nation. And so we sort of took together different pieces that the experts sort of considered the best practice or the most accessible sort of parts of a definition that could assist in creating something that you all may be willing to recommend to the legislature. So we'll go over that definition again during the discussion portion of the agenda item, but that's sort of an update of where we are now. And I wanted to reference in the previous meeting, we talked a little bit about getting presentations from different agencies in California about their early intervention systems and how they use civilian complaints in those systems. In order to sort of get to the place of having presenters, as I mentioned, we've done some outreach to the agencies to get a feel for what is out there, how things are working on the ground now, and who would be willing to come and give a presentation. And I think that given sort of these really big buckets of completely, I would say, focusing on the civilian complaint process and procedure, as well as understanding how those complaints end up being used in an early intervention system, there is not necessarily the capacity to do both in this year, given the fact that we need presentations and more research on how those work. Because I can tell you from our outreach, at least in Wave 3, for example, there are about 23 agencies, and they're all very different. They all use civilian complaints in a different way. Some of them, we don't really know how they use them, we just know that they do. And so there's a lot more information that we still need to gather in order to really dive into that part. And so I think that that is something that we may be more capable of doing in the following year. But this year we can focus on really working on getting that process and procedure to its best as you all see fit. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Allison first to see whether or not we have quorum, and then we can kind of get into the discussion of the substance of the report.
Do not yet have a quorum, so I think we can get into the substance, and hopefully we will have a quorum before the end in case the subcommittee would like to vote on anything.
Okay, sounds good. And I should also sort of give explanation for that. Thank you for the reminder, Allison. So essentially, what we'll do is go through the proposed subcommittee report, and based on what you all discuss, what you all want to recommend as something to include, for example, in a letter to the legislature, then you all would have to vote on pushing that forward to the full board so that the full board can have an opportunity to discuss before it becomes a letter that we send to the legislature on your behalf. And I think Chief Swing, if anyone has questions, hopefully about how that worked last time, you might be able to assist, since I know you were on the board at that time. All right, so part of the
Sorry, Dominique, I was on mute.
Oh, that's okay.
I just want to clarify, assist in regards to how the letter was generated, or?
Yes, just if other board members have questions about how that worked generally.
Okay.
And that may be something that comes up sort of after you all have a chance to discuss the recommendations and the section of the report. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so we can all be looking at the section of the report. Can everybody see this section on the screen? If I could get a thumbs up or a verbal yes, that would be great.
Yeah.
Okay,
So
thank you.
Is this the attachment 8th draft to share
Yes.
or complaint?
Yes, that's
Okay.
it. So this section is going to include data analysis from the Research Center, and that was also included as an attachment. Normally, that is something that the board reviews, and there's no necessarily presentation from the Research Center, but if folks have questions about any of that data, the Research Center is on the line in case folks do have questions. But beyond that section, again, you will see that we have the review of each agency's civilian complaint forms. And as I mentioned, we structured it a little differently this year to try to make it a little more engaging than full paragraphs that we had last year and the year before. And it kind of goes through a breakdown of each agency. You can see that here. And then, of course, we get to the matrix. And I'm not sure if folks on the board have any questions about the matrix, the reviews of each agency that we would like to discuss, that you all would like to discuss before we talk more about the civilian complaint process and procedure information. Okay, hearing none, I will move to the next section, but of course, can always come back to this.
I have a question, Dominique.
Yes, go ahead.
This is Lawanda. My question is, during COVID-19, how are they going to handle this? Because a lot of the stations were closed. A lot of people were not able to access law enforcement agencies. They had no access to internet and they had no access to the stations. So
That's
how
a
will
great
this data be
question.
handled in 2020 and 2021 with these stations, especially in LA County? The stations are all closed.
That's a great
You have
question,
to have
Lawanda.
some.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
I'm just because I see how they're saying, were you able to call online? These methods were not in 2020 and 2021. A lot of this stuff was not able to be. You weren't able to use any of it. So how would
That's
they
a really
measure it?
So that's a great point. The data itself, the analysis of how many complaints an agency receives is separate from this breakdown of each of the agencies and how someone can get access to filing the complaint. But I will say on my part of doing the assessment of sort of each agency's form and their accessibility, I did not ask anything about COVID-19 effects. I think that would have been a great question, but it wasn't something that was sort of on our radar when we were doing the outreach. And I don't know if for next year's report, when the Research Center does the data analysis for those civilian complaints, if maybe that would be a question you all would want to ask to figure out what the effects may have been to that. Okay.
Thank you.
So, yeah, no problem. So the next section, as I mentioned, is the sort of the meat regarding state law and the civilian complaint process and procedure. This section goes through each of the penal code sections or other parts of the law that affect civilian complaints. As we mentioned before, there is a requirement that there be policies or a procedure on investigating complaints, but there are no specifics to that in state law. There are specifics to other things, such as when someone should be notified, what types of information can be disclosed through state law, how an agency must save records regarding civilian complaints. But there is, I think, a lot of different sort of gaps that folks have mentioned in the past, such as the civilian complaint definition or other areas like tracking and other things that we'll see in the list of recommendations that you all have already kind of identified in the past few years. So after the section of the state law, we have here the potential best practice recommendations that you all may want to make to the legislature. And specifically, we begin with the civilian complaint definition. So in the last meeting, I showed you all a few of the definitions that were already provided for in the board's report. That was the LA grand jury's definition, which I hope you all can see these definitions on my screen. Are we all looking at that? Okay, perfect. So here we have the LA County Grand Jury. Their definition is a complaint is an allegation by any person that a sworn officer, custodial employee of an agency, or the agency itself has behaved inappropriately as defined by the person making the allegation. The board report also cited to NACL's definition, essentially allegations that if proven true would represent misconduct under the police department's policies and procedures. The board report has also mentioned Sacramento PD's definition or change of their civilian complaint process and procedure based on the DOJ stipulated judgment. Their definition for a complaint are allegations of misconduct against any department employee involving a violation of any law, rule, regulation, policy, or other improper job performance. Our experts provided us or suggested to us to look at Newark PD's civilian complaint definition and their policy procedure on civilian complaints, which is somewhere of 20 pages of information. This is for Newark, New Jersey, not to be confused with Newark, California, in case there are folks who didn't know that that exists. So their definition is, they term it misconduct, is defined as any commission of a crime or offense, violation of division rules, regulations, policies, procedures, or conduct that adversely reflects upon the division. Allegations of misconduct can stem from internal or external complaints. Also mentioned in the previous board reports was Los Angeles County Sheriff's definition, or I would say separation of the types of complaints. So a personnel complaint for them is an external allegation of misconduct. And there's also internal complaints. So given these definitions that I've shared with you and that the board has discussed in their 2020 board report, we consulted with our experts and created a potential definition for you all to provide feedback on and give us, what your thoughts are on this type of definition. But this definition is largely based on what we've seen in these other policies, feedback from our experts who do this work across the nation and here in California, and also thinking about the gaps that exist in certain policies and certain definitions as it stands now. So I will leave this here. I'm going to read it out loud so that folks who are better at hearing than seeing can hear the definition as well. And then I'd love for you all to have a discussion on this definition and provide any feedback for what you all think. So the proposed definition for the subcommittee 2 workshop is complaint means either of the following. Any issue brought to a department or agency where the complainant perceives that an officer engaged in criminal conduct, misconduct, abusive or discriminatory behavior, neglect of duty, corrupt activity, inappropriate or discourteous conduct, or violation of any law or rules and regulation of the department or the agency. Or a disagreement solely with the policies, procedures, or services of the department or agency and not with the performance of any personnel. If during the course of investigating this type of complaint, an officer discovers conduct by another officer that could be the basis of a complaint under that definition above, an officer should submit a complaint which should be logged, tracked, and investigated separately from the original complaint.
That sounds good, Dominique. I'm just concerned about Part B due to COVID-19. Some officers, law enforcement officers, have voiced concerns regarding COVID-19 with vaccinations and different things, and it could go against policy. And I don't think that should be a definition. Yeah, I don't know. What do you say? What do you say, David? I don't know, because especially with this COVID-19, I got to be concerned because I don't want officers to be losing their law enforcement to be losing their job because they went against the policy on some things that they may not believe in. So what do you say, David? I don't know.
That
There
pesky mute
also,
button. I I have some questions about what's proposed, specifically, Lawanda, related to your comments about Part B and how that might apply to COVID-19. I think that those are going to be city rules and regulations, and I don't know if the representative of PORAC is on our call today. His name escapes me. I apologize for that. The board member. But my understanding is that if an organization chooses to mandate a vaccine, that's within the organization's authority and scope, and that's, I think, a larger conversation, candidly, than our conversation here today. When I look at A as an example, I'm a less is more kind of individual, and I could omit everything from misconduct to discourteous conduct and just have it simply say any issue brought to a department or agency where the complainant perceives that an officer engaged in criminal conduct or a violation of any law or rule or regulation of the department or agency. Because everything mentioned in that middle section is a violation of either law, departmental policy, or rule or regulation. And so that feels redundant, and I don't know that it needs to be called out explicitly in the definition of a complaint. As for letter B, as a matter of course, if an officer discovers misconduct by another officer, that is usually handled through an internal investigation, and we're talking about complaints or more external. It's handled through an internal investigation. That conduct is brought to a supervisor, and then the supervisor initiates the proper protocols within the agency. There's the duty to intercede, which is part of other, like for excessive force or other behavior. There's a requirement for the officer to act and intervene in policy, and so I don't know that the filing of another complaint accomplishes more than what's already being accomplished today.
And I will say that part of the, I would say, breadth of the definition is to encompass those both internal and external complaints, because there are certain agencies that do distinguish them, and sometimes they're treated differently as far as how they're investigated, where they're saved, for example, whether or not they get used in an early warning intervention system, for example. So I hear you. Just wanted to express that was part of the reason why this was written the way it was, because, not every agency is doing the same thing, and there may be requirements in some agencies for certain information sharing to a supervisor, but that may not necessarily always happen. And so wanting to cover these different bases, because there are agencies that separate them out in certain ways.
Well, I know that agencies separate out complaints between internal and external. An internal complaint is an internal affairs or administrative investigation, whereas an external complaint is a citizens complaint, community complaint. It's a different tracking system. So you're on point there. I think there's good reason why that happens, but so I don't know if we can lump complaint into any and all, as opposed to continuing to bifurcate internal versus external.
I see that Board Member Vang has her video on. Do you have feedback you'd
Yeah,
like to
I thank you for the clarity in terms of A and B. I was trying to figure out what the difference was in terms of like just clarifying that A is supposed to be for external complaints and then B is actually internal. I think my question, which I could have missed this, but the goal of defining complaints is to include it into the report, or is it also to make a recommendation to our legislators? Or yeah, I'm just trying to figure out what the goal of defining it for us is, so that
Yeah, of course. So it would be included in the report, but after conversations from the subcommittee at the previous meeting, my understanding was that they wanted to workshop, or you all wanted to workshop a definition to recommend to the legislature, given the fact that it is such a glaring gap in the state law, and that affects pretty much, everything that happens after that as far as the complaint process procedure stuff.
thank you.
And just to jump in, the subcommittee, the full board would have to vote on sending something to the legislature, but the subcommittee can vote to bring this, to recommend that the full board vote on this at the October 20th meeting, since the meeting later this week is focused on the regulations. I do believe Pastor Kennedy has also joined, so I do believe we have a quorum. We can get to the voting issues later, but just in terms of any votes that you all might want to take today, I believe we do have a quorum.
And I just want to add one more clarification, because Cha, you said that B. I did not mean to say that it was only for internal complaints, but it also is to encompass situations where there are some agencies that will mark a particular complaint as simply an inquiry or something not related to an individual personnel, and so therefore it's not investigated like a personnel complaint, and instead more of a general complaint. So the point of B is to encompass if there is some kind of complaint that is about policy, but also through doing some investigation on that, find out that there's a particular officer who is engaging in some kind of misconduct because of that complaint, then that too should be considered something that should be investigated as a personnel complaint. So it's just kind of responding to some of the things that we've seen in different policies. And it looks like we actually have another board member here, our newest board member.
Is that my cue? I can jump in?
Yes, feel free if you have some.
Cool.
And I hope, Cha, if you were not finished, I apologize for stepping in, but you all can go ahead and discuss.
No, that's great. I just wanted to piggyback on your comment. I appreciate it because I was going to kind of make the same comment or ask a similar question. One thing I actually liked about B, at least the way that I was reading it, was that it opens the door for people to file concern or complaint about a standing policy or practice, not about a particular individual. So I was in agreement that this, I see this as more as like external, internal. I think what B also does, although we could think about whether the language does it appropriately, is I think it opens it up for that other sort of whole family of feedback that would, not necessarily be about a particular individual or specific interaction, but could refer to a broader set of policies or practices held by the department.
And so just as a follow-up question to that, I'm not sure where Board Member Armeline went. I'm just curious if someone's complaining about department policy or practice. Currently our system is we have 4 different findings: sustained, not sustained, unfounded, and exonerated. So it wouldn't necessarily be a complaint per se under that, because it couldn't have one of those findings. It wouldn't be a sustained complaint about a policy. That's more of a So that's I'm just kind of curious, trying to flush that out. Is how do you envision an officer, an agency handling complaints about policy that are codified as part of an overall complaint process?
I share your question, and I was actually thinking about for instance, right? So let's say, for instance, someone is complaining that there's a disparity in people being stopped at a stop or something like that, and what that would look like. Does that look like research into that claim? And then there's a verification of that claim? So I share your question, actually. I was going to follow up, and glad that you beat me to it.
So you both bring up a really good point, and something that I would say we haven't delved into in these recommendations, but something that I mentioned in the previous subcommittee and that was kind of discussed and has been discussed in the board reports before is about classifying complaints, but also the outcome. So the 4 categories that you mentioned, Chief Swing, and how that relates to the submission of data to DOJ. So there are particular outcomes listed in the penal code regarding civilian complaints, and there are certain outcomes that need to be reported to DOJ under AB 953 for you all to review, which is that data that is also attached to these materials. Some agencies actually use additional outcomes than the ones that are included in the penal code. So they may have those 4 or 5, I forget how many it is, and others that they themselves have designated through their own procedure. So part of, I think, a conversation that has been had in the reports before is this sort of discrepancy of what may exist in the law versus what happens on the ground with agencies. So I think part of this larger conversation that this subcommittee is having is how do we improve this process as a whole? And part of that could be a recommendation about those outcomes or a recommendation about the classification of complaints upon receipt. The definition is only the starting point of this, but I do think that you both raised great questions about that, and it could be something that you all discuss further as far as recommendations to make to sort of create something that's more streamlined and more aligned with each other, because as I mentioned, the departments or the law enforcement agencies in California have to submit data on particular outcomes for their civilian complaints. The penal code has certain outcomes, and they're not necessarily the same to the T. And each agency can also add additional outcomes. So that is something else that you all may want to consider in thinking about these types of recommendations you want to make to the legislature about creating a more equitable and uniform civilian complaint process and procedure.
I think a potential unintended consequence of having an opportunity to file a complaint about a policy or a procedure and not make it person specific, looking at the example that was just given a few moments ago, by our very nature, most people are conflict adverse, and I can see a complaint, if there's an option to make it about a procedure or a policy and not about a person, that complaint being made about the policy or the procedure. I just want to highlight that as a potential unintended consequence of creating a separate category around policies.
If any board members have also additional sort of red line edits to this definition, I am open to hearing them. This is for you all to create together. So I know, Chief Swing, you gave me yours. I've made that comment. And I think I heard Board Member Armeline say something about potentially B being not at the best wording. So there might be additional or suggested wording for that. Okay, well, we can come back if you all think of something, but we can keep talking, or you all can keep talking about the next part of these recommendations that you all may want to make to the legislature. So the next sort of list of recommendations vary. There's a lot of them, and a lot of them could be some best practices that are already being incorporated by agencies, such as the ones that Chief Swing mentioned in the previous subcommittee meetings, such as tracking or providing information, but these would assist in making it uniform across the state. All of the recommendations in this list come from recommendations that the board has already made in its reports. This would just be a recommendation that the legislature add some of these to law to ensure uniformity. And they cover a lot of different areas, not just accessibility of complaints, but also ensuring that there is certain information provided to a complainant when they submit their complaint, to ensuring that there are specific details about the investigation process detailed in the policy, such as a timeline or including standards of review and disposition categories to complainants, which many agencies do provide that. But this again would just be to ensure uniformity. So I'm not sure if folks have had a chance to review these recommendations, but I'm happy to let you all discuss what is on there and figure out if there is any that you all maybe don't want, or those that you do, or if there are things that are not on there. Of course, there's also space to include other ideas that you all have about improving the civil complaint process and procedure. So I will go ahead and let you all discuss that.
So Dominique, as I understand it, the recommendation from the committee would go to the board. The board would vote potentially requiring quote unquote agencies to do the following, although the authority of the board to require is not a binding authority. It's then a recommendation to the legislature. Is that, as I understand it?
Yes, that's correct. So we would draft a letter similar to, or kind of similar to, the one for the Penal Code 148.6, send that off, and then you also can include this information in the report as you all see fit.
Sure. I like a lot of the different bullet points that are here. I like the calling out the need for multi-languages. I don't know if 5% is the right number. I don't know that space well enough. I just like the fact that it's being called out and is being required or recommended. Timeline, making sure agencies establish and to the best of their ability abide by a timeline. One area that may pose a challenge, because I'm not on the technical side of things, is the online portal. And while that might be more feasible for a larger or medium-sized agency, the majority of agencies in California are smaller in number, and I don't know what that would require from a technology standpoint to create a separate portal to track and to track complaints and all the rest.
I will say that 5% comes from the
Bilingual Services Act. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But of course, if folks thought that was not enough, we can suggest something else if that is what the board would like.
And I think requires is a strong word. I try and stay away from absolutes. I would change that to recommend instead of require.
For, you're saying for the entire list?
Yeah, improve the
Oh,
civilian complaint process and procedure by recommending agencies to blank.
do other board members have thoughts on that distinction between recommend and require if this is a letter to the legislature?
Recommend is always easier to get people to understand instead of saying the requirement. Yeah, if you recommend it, it gives them a chance to have a voice on it. So I think recommend would be the perfect word to use. I think it would seem a little bit.
I agree.
Um, I would, of course, I think recommend is always better. It's always easier. I feel like the required, I don't know I think some clarity on the authority of this board I think we're making a recommendation to the legislators, if we want to be like really just tough on making sure that we have really good civilian complaints and the process to make sure that people feel like they're going to be heard. I think the word require is stronger. We and that as legislators, they will ultimately. We know the process would ultimately bring it. The language will change the language a little, but uh, on my end, I'm leaning more towards require. And I perfectly understand where everybody's coming from in terms of recommendation and require, but I think the stronger language would be to require.
And I will just mention that, all of these come from the previous board report. So these have already been recommended by the board generally to law enforcement through the annual reports. But this would be a letter to the legislator recommending that they create legislation to improve this process by doing XYZ thing that you all suggest. So I don't know if that also, provides some context for considering whether it should be a require or recommend type of language. And I know we have a few other board members on that we haven't heard from yet. I saw their videos turn on briefly, but we'll give them some time and see if they have anything on that. Okay, I think they don't. But so if there's any other feedback, Cha, because I know yours was focused on the require versus recommend suggestion by Chief Swing. If there's any other comments by anyone about the recommendations included in this list, please go ahead and share them.
My concern is having the community have access to filing the complaints. And that seems to be an issue always. And I know people say, well, we got it online. Well, a lot of people in the community, sometimes they may have an issue, but they don't go online to voice their complaint. And the majority of them don't. How do we deal with that? How do we interact with that? What do we have in place? Because everyone's aware that majority of the people don't make no complaint.
I would say one of the recommendations included in there to hopefully, combat that issue is to ensure that complaint forms or that individuals have the ability to file a complaint not only at the law enforcement agency's office itself, but also provide complaint forms at other government offices such as City Hall or libraries, for example, sort of spreading it out so that folks who may feel more comfortable filling out that form or talking to someone outside of a law enforcement office may be more willing to file a complaint because of that. But maybe you're also thinking about not so much accessing the form itself then and there, but also feeling confident that their complaint will be investigated, which is another sort of issue. And so I do think, part of these best recommendations is including more information, or I would say providing more information to members of the community about that process. There is information provided now about different agencies' process, different disposition categories that they have, but it really depends on each agency. In this recommendation list, we also added a few bullet points related to accountability as far as civilian complaints. And so generally, a few of these are, ensuring that the members of the public understand that they have the right to file a complaint. And there's a best recommendation in there about ensuring that the member of the community has the opportunity to review their statement for accuracy. So say, I know some instances folks may give the complaint orally and a law enforcement officer may write it down. And so a best practice recommendation on this list also includes giving the complainant an opportunity to review that summary to ensure that it is accurate to what they are reporting, because there have been instances where folks feel that that is not what happens, right? That they may complain about one thing and it turns out in writing that it's something else. And so the investigation is totally not related to what they themselves felt happened. So I think there's some recommendations in there, such as ensuring that all investigations are investigated. And that really comes down to, again, whether or not the definition is clear, because if there's a complaint that somebody submits that isn't categorized as a civilian complaint, it may not be investigated. And so all of these things kind of work together, but we have some recommendations in there about that issue regarding feeling welcome, trusting the process, ensuring that there's more accountability, and I think ensuring that folks understand and have knowledge of the process. And I think I know Pastor Kennedy is a little busy and he might be on phone, but at the previous subcommittee meeting, he recommended, a tracking sort of number, a way for the member of the community to be able to check in on whether or not where their investigation, or like where the complaint investigation is. And so we have a recommendation in here about tracking, about providing a number. And I think with that, I was hoping Board Member Kennedy would be able to engage in this conversation, but part of it was too making sure that this information is logged, and are there any particular data points about the complaint, about anything related to that you all would want to ensure that agencies are tracking to ensure accountability. But I think there's several things in there, but I would love to hear if you have any suggestions, LaWanda, based on your experience or the experience of those in your community that what would help make the process more accessible and also help individuals feel more confident that their complaint will be investigated and heard.
Thank you, Dominique. It goes back down to community-based, like it needs to be involved with the community, like with the station needs to have a community meeting, letting you know about the complaints and setting it up where people are allowed to, where they don't fear. And it just takes more law enforcement getting involved more with the community, and the community getting more involved with law enforcement. Because I believe if you bring it into the community and you meet them where they're at in their community, it would be better. It would be better, especially with them knowing, because sometimes people file a complaint and they never hear anything afterwards. So they don't know what happened. And then when I call law enforcement and they'll say, hey, LaWanda, we did an investigation. We found out boom, boom, boom. Well, how will the community know? You didn't. Yeah. Where is the communication? So it needs to be some form of monthly meeting or it needs to be some form where they have to talk to the community and let the community know, and a community meeting.
That's really helpful. And I will say, I forgot to mention, part of the recommendation about ensuring the complaint forms are accessible in other areas that are not just law enforcement offices. One of them is community-centered areas in the community. So, there may be a organization that is willing to bridge that gap, that they may want to keep on file complaint forms that they can provide to people who then go and submit that, to an agency. But that's great. I've written down your suggestion.
Oh, and I know a lot of law enforcement agencies work with a lot of community agencies, and they would allow them to get the complaints and submit to them so they can look at them. You have deputy chiefs that are wanting to know if there's a problem. They are very concerned. They want to resolve it. They want to bridge that gap. So I know a lot of them would be willing to do something like that.
Um, quick, I was trying to go through the recommendations. Do we have is there a bullet point in terms of recommendations for what follow-up looks like? Or in there, I thought I saw something, but I wasn't sure if I was just seeing things.
There is, I think, one or two. So the law already requires that a complainant be informed, I think, up to 30 days after, or
Got it.
something about 30 days regarding the disposition. So they should get something in writing about what the conclusion of the investigation was. And they are allowed to have a copy of their statement at the time that they filed the complaint. There's no indication that that's necessarily all statements. So if someone provides a statement another time, it's not clear that they are provided with that. But in the recommendations, we did say that complainants should be given some sort of, let me see where, I want to make sure that I share it correctly. Might be down here. Okay, so I'm going to highlight it in blue for now. That when they submit their complaint, that they are given a tracking number for their complaint. They are provided with the information about who is investigating and contact information for that person. Some agencies already provide this. Some people, I know there's an agency in the Bay Area, or perhaps that's Central California actually, that provides something called a complaint receipt. So essentially it's a paper with a number, the tracking number for that complaint and information on how to contact the office for an update. But again, that isn't something that all agencies do, but some may participate in that already. So we included that, and we also included a bullet point that provides they be given a timeline of what the investigation will look like, hopefully, and information about the standard of review for that complaint, the disposition category, and that they be informed if there is any delay in the timeline for investigating, so that they are kept apprised throughout the process and feel as if their complaint is being heard, because they are hearing more back and forth. So we included, I think there's about 2 bullet points on that. I'm going to make sure that we keep those together so they are a little bit more easy to find.
Thank you.
I see Pastor Kennedy. I'm not sure if
Oh,
you wanted to jump in.
yes, I'm in. Thank you. Hello, everyone.
Okay, so I'm gonna just go over the last piece of information included here. But if any board members have feedback on the recommendations, the definition, can always give that to me. This section also includes that in the letter, or a suggestion that in the letter, the board can, how would I say, re-ask or impress upon the legislature again that there needs to be some resolution as to Penal Code 148.6. The board sent the legislature that letter back in 2019, and that has not yet been resolved. So in a letter, we can include that again as a reminder, and hopefully they will resolve it, because it is difficult for law enforcement to know what they should be doing when it relates to this. But in addition to Penal Code 148.6, in this new round of review of civilian complaints, we've seen an increase in a civil advisory on agencies' websites, on their civilian complaint forms. And so that is about Civil Code 47.5, which essentially, the law itself was to allow officers to bring a civil suit against someone for filing a false complaint. This particular code is similar to Penal Code 148.6 in the sense that there is some conflict regarding state and federal courts assessing the language, but also some conflict in the state itself, whether or not this is enforceable. But I think one of the best practices that the board has discussed pretty much every year in the past is ensuring that there isn't deterrent language, like Penal Code 148.6, or language that would require, or language that would deter someone from filing a complaint. That is not a bullet point that I included above, but you all can agree or discuss whether or not to include some kind of recommendation to the legislature as well to prohibit deterrent language from being included on the civilian complaint form or on the website. And Penal Code 148.6 and Civil Code 47.5 aren't the only deterrent language that exists on forms. There are several other things that are not related to any particular law, but there are several statements that I've seen, and some of them are outlined above in the agency-specific reviews that basically try to warn folks about filing a bona fide complaint and ensuring that they are not abusing the process, and whether or not that is something that should exist on an agency's website or a civilian complaint form based on best practices is to remove deterrent language. But I don't know if that's something that the subcommittee would want to include as a general recommendation, and not only specifically to Penal Code 148.6 or Civil Code 47.5.
Dominique, I'm concerned those things being on there could create a problem with people filing a complaint. They would be somewhat concerned. So how do we deal with that? There has to be some way that there has to be a medium, because it's still like you're victimizing people and silencing them and not allowing them to voice their opinion. And I understand we have to be careful, but saying that on the form that I'm filing a complaint on is, I don't know.
And I will say for Penal Code 148.6, many agencies have only used part of the language of that section and not all of it. They include the language that basically provides that folks can file a complaint. They have to keep the documents for 5 years, but it is still right above usually the signature form, and also, as the board put in their letter, can sort of impede the ability to file an anonymous complaint, for example. And so, I think the way to address that would be to, again, ask the legislature to resolve the 148.6 issue, or to generally require that they prohibit deterrent language such as these things on civilian complaint forms. So we can include that as a bullet point on the list of items to the legislature.
Please do. Thank you.
So is the recommendation that I'm hearing is to omit or have asked the legislature to repeal Civil Code Section 47.5?
I think it's a similar request to the Penal Code 148.6 in that to resolve the conflict, whether that is to repeal 148.6 and 47.5 or to do something to resolve the conflict that currently exists.
Okay.
So it would be similar ask to Penal Code 148.6.
Sure. Something that's different today than when 148.6 and 47.5 were codified is the proliferation and use of body-worn cameras and other video in law enforcement interactions. That really makes it pretty clear if the allegations are remotely accurate or have remotely occurred. And so that has allowed us as a profession to be able to adjudicate cases more expeditiously because we have video that shows precisely what happened. As you can probably imagine, as a chief, I'm hesitant to remove sections that where there are no sanctions for someone who files a knowingly false complaint and blatantly lies on a form and files a complaint about an officer about conduct that did not happen, and there's no sanctions for that individual for doing so. So I don't know that I can vote in support of omitting 47.5 and taking that off the books completely. It's a civil penalty. It's not criminal. So.
Understandable, Chief. I'm just concerned that people won't sign the complaint if that's right above the signature. But I don't know.
Yeah, I think there's other things that can happen. I just don't think that repealing 47.5 is the right path. Mr. Kennedy, I saw you had your hand up. I didn't mean to cut you off, sir.
No, I did not have my hand up. I was waving. I'm sorry. Yeah, that's a tough issue. Really is a tough issue, and my concern here would be, civilians have a way to file a complaint without fear of some type of negative action against them. And so that, I think, is what we are all after. I suspect that a handful of people are willing to, well, we saw the reports and a lot of them were unsustained, so I'm not sure if the people were intentionally filing false reports, but I suspect the good citizens would not do that, and we'd have a handful who's trying to go after an officer for whatever reason. But our work is to try to make sure that civilians have a way to file complaints without any fear of a reprimand or some negative harm done to them.
Kind of piggyback on Board Member Kennedy's comment. I also definitely agree, and I feel like I had a thought, my thought process, but it's kind of going all over the place. I also see as even with the disclaimer, if somebody was to file a complaint against an officer, I feel like if a false report, like the disclaimer wouldn't like deter them. But in reality, the folks who will be impacted by having a disclaimer are community members who are not filing a false report, but also by putting that, I think there's also this fear that you're having the system, like police investigating complaints within their own departments. And if I think there's this already a community perception that like most complaints are not going to be fairly investigated already. So with a disclaimer saying such as this, I think it's going to deter a lot of folks from really just making any kind of complaints, right? And that's what we really want our community members to feel safe and feel comfortable enough to make the complaints without feeling like they're going to get penalized if the investigations come back or in any way seems like it was falsified. And I think the fear is always like, how can we create a system where they feel like they're to make sure that
I might add,
for them.
Chief, I do understand. Oh, wait, you're still speaking. Sorry.
I
Oh,
think
it's okay.
tech issues.
No, you're fine. My internet's slow.
Chief,
Go ahead.
I hear your concern, and I'm very close to law enforcement officials. We as public figures, we come under attack daily. Sometimes our work is thankless, and if I filed a lawsuit against everyone who criticized me or tried to get me in trouble, I'd probably be a multimillionaire, maybe a billionaire. But I'm a public servant, and what I have to do is make sure that the organization I work with is a safe place for me when I'm falsely accused. Now, if something goes to the level that could bring felony charges against me, that's when our team brings in lawyers, and then law enforcement is brought in. That's when the ante is upped. But those normal accusations, it's a part of the course for being a public leader. I would offer that, but I agree with you. We should not. We need to think about how to address this issue of, the paper mill groups that just file papers after paper trying to hurt law enforcement agencies and clog up the courts. And then people who want to hurt law enforcement officials and ex-spouse, and the list can go on.
Yeah, and I understand that as public servants, we're held to a higher standard. I think one of the differences with law enforcement is that a complaint results in an investigation. So if someone makes a complaint that is unfounded and knowingly unfounded and false, the officer is still subject to a thorough investigation, questioning, statements, etc. And that's just sometimes that is just part of the job. I'm just trying to ensure that if there are complaints that are knowingly false,
Yeah.
and that there is, again, I don't have the answer. I just don't think that repealing 47.5 is the solution. There's a question in the chat about the frequency that's used. I don't know how often at all 47.5 is used. I can't think of a time in my 25 years where I have heard of the application about 47.5 in a civil proceeding. So it's not used often. I just think that resource should be available if something happens that is that egregious.
I get it.
And if I may add, just in the research on these two pieces, so Penal Code 148.6, by law, law enforcement is required to include that language on complaint forms, and that's kind of where one of the issues is, because the courts have decided, in some cases this is constitutional, in some cases this is not. And so that's why some agencies have sort of amended the language. They've included part of Penal Code 148.6, but not the entire text of 148.6. And the difference with Civil Code 47.5 is that there is no requirement for that to be listed or acknowledged on a complaint form, but it is in some cases put on those forms. So, potentially a compromise in this situation that, you all can discuss with the rest of the board is, how would you want to proceed? Would you want to proceed to ask them to ask the legislature to resolve the 47.5 issue like 148.6, or something more like, simply prohibit that be listed on the complaint form? Doesn't mean that people don't have the ability to use that, because it exists in state law. Once it's been, once the enforceability of it is kind of discussed between the courts, that will be what it is. But if we're looking specifically at accessibility, perhaps part of the conversation could be either, doing away with it, or prohibiting that disclaimer on the form itself, since it is not currently required, but it is there on many forms, at least in this last wave of agencies.
Well, I hear you saying 47.5 does not have to go on the form, but if someone intentionally files a false report against an officer, that officer still has access to that code section.
Yes, but that's what the caveat of, as I mentioned, this code itself, different courts have found this to be constitutional and not constitutional, so that may depend on their ability to prevail or to take on that case, for example. But it would still be in the books.
No, I'm sorry, I'm asking the wrong question there. Okay. Wow. So we've had cases where courts, make sure I heard this right, where it was not on the form, someone made a false report, the officer went after them, and the court said, no, the person wasn't warned.
No, it was not. It wasn't about the warning. It was just about the law itself, whether or not it's constitutional based on the First Amendment.
Oh, I see.
To give sort of these protections to language about law enforcement. And courts have come out differently. In some cases, it's been constitutional, an acceptable provision, and others it has been unconstitutional. And, if this is a conversation that folks want to have, well, if the subcommittee votes to have this conversation with the full board, we can bring more information to you all specifically on this piece, if that would be helpful.
I think that would be, go ahead.
I see Richard's comment. Chief, talk about that comment. An officer has access to courts for malicious or false reports. Tell us about that.
I'm not aware of that comment, and I know that, so I can't comment on it. I don't have any knowledge about an officer having access to that information. I'll wait until he has an opportunity to speak in public comment to understand that better.
Richard, you want to tell us more about that?
Well, right now, I think we're in a conversation with the board, and we'll open it up to public comment later on in our agenda.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I'm mistaken him for a member.
I do believe one of the board members may be making comments in the chat, but I actually can't see the chat, so it would be super helpful if we could get those shared verbally, if there's anything related to this conversation or any.
Hi, this is Board Member LaWanda again. Mike, I'm sorry if I cut someone off. Sorry.
Oh no, you're good. Go ahead.
My concern is if you take the 47.5 off, and then an officer tries to sue someone, and the civilian wasn't notified that this could happen. I don't know. Yeah, people need to know up front, but I don't know if it should be on the form that you're signing. There has to be a way to not make people feel uncomfortable when they're filing a complaint.
We do need to protect officers from malicious attacks. They put it on the line every single day, and it's just, we want to protect our citizens, but we also want to protect our officers from malicious attacks.
Most definitely. So that's what I'm saying. How do we meet it? Because 47.5, it gives the officers that right. But if you, a civilian, you don't know there's a 47.5, you don't know that this could happen.
You should know if you sign something, a legal document, and you are maliciously attacking someone, you are lying about any kind of sworn officer or official, you should have enough common sense to know that could come back on you. But I do understand the warning. We cannot allow citizens to feel free to attack sworn officers, and that is what the chief is concerned about.
Mike, sorry, Dominique, I didn't mean to put my comments in the chat. I was just trying not to interrupt. But I just to explain what I was saying. So part of the reason I was asking about data is I don't want us to, as a scholar, I always wonder if when we're spending a ton of time on something like this, to the extent it's even a thing, this sounds to me kind of like a voter fraud thing. Like we're all talking about something that sounds really terrible and all that, but no one can even tell me if it's ever happened. So why don't we stop with all of that hand wringing until someone can actually present data suggesting this is even an issue? No offense, but I don't know where that data is or why that's a thing. And until we see that data, it isn't a thing. Or until we see those examples, it's not a thing. It's just something hypothetical. So that said, it sounds like we do have clear direction from the law that we have to present this information in the form. And also, I agree that, if people really are on the hook for legal liabilities here, you have to tell them that as a sort of, again, it's kind of a legal obligation. But I think the concern, and it sounds to me like everybody shares this concern, is that we just want to present that information in such a way that does not intimidate people from filing an otherwise legitimate complaint. And so maybe we could focus our conversation to specific suggestions about that instead of, waxing philosophical about an issue that we don't even know about. That would be my suggestion, but I'll leave it to folks to decide.
Dominic, I think is there a way you can actually bring some more data and some more research on both the codes, and then I think this could merit a larger board conversation where there might be a little more information present, a little more feedback from all the other board members too on this particular issue.
That sounds
I'm definitely
good.
supportive of trying to ascertain some of the data on it, to the point that was just made. I don't know there's data that we can pull though
Right.
that speaks to how the code section or 148.6 on the complaint discourages complaints. There's a strong feeling by many on our board that it does. However, unfortunately, it's trying to prove the absence or trying to prove something that doesn't exist or isn't present, and how do we do that? And I think that will be a challenge I'm sure that DOJ staff has in trying to find data to prove up or down argument.
Okay, so I just want to make sure that I have understood all of that that you all have talked about today, before we sort of move to some of the other agenda items and public comment. So on this piece specifically about deterrent language, we want more information on 47.5, potentially data if it's out there, to bring to the conversation with the board if you all vote to do that. And as far as the recommendations above regarding accountability and improvement of the civilian complaint process and procedure, it sounds to me that you all are okay with what has been included for discussion as something to ask to go to the board, and you can have the conversation with the board about the language regarding requiring or recommending. And for the definition of a civilian complaint, I've gotten feedback from Chief Swing and a few others verbally here, but I don't know if we've settled on a definition, and that may be something that you all want to also discuss with the full board. But if any subcommittee members have, specific edits that they would recommend to this definition, to add, to remove, However, you can please feel free to send that to me, and I can prepare it for the future conversation with the board. But it sounds to me that that is sort of where we're at with these different pieces of it. And it does seem like you all are interested in having the larger conversation with the board about what specifically to recommend to the legislature to improve the civilian complaint process in California.
Dominic, I have one edit for that paragraph that's on the screen right now. It
This
reads
one?
a glaring gap in state law is lack of definition.
Mm-hmm.
I would prefer just to say a gap in state law is a lack of definition. I think glaring is a subjective word. I think it's better to keep the sentence as objective as possible.
Okay. All right, so it doesn't sound like we have any other feedback at this time. And I want to make sure that we do this procedurally correct. So given the interest to talk to the board, I believe that you all will need to raise a motion to move this forward as far as talking about recommendations to the legislature by a vote, but that vote should come after public comment. But I want to actually just ask Allison to be sure. Do they need to make the motion now or have a conversation about that vote before the public comment? Just want to make sure we are informing the members of the public all the way before public comment.
Procedurally, I think it is helpful to be that everyone on the subcommittee is clear on what they will be voting on and what will move forward. And then we would like to open it up to public comment before actually taking the vote, just in case that influences the board. So I think procedurally it's helpful to figure out what you are all voting to move forward on, whether you'd like to vote to move the whole section forward and have a discussion with the full board, whether you'd like to discuss different aspects of it. You can break it up as well if there's not a quorum on certain aspects, but there is on others. You can at least move some of them forward. So that's just the only thing would be to procedurally clarify what you all are moving forward for a full board vote at the October board meeting.
I'm so sorry to have missed one part here, but did we not agree upon a definition of a civilian complaint?
Not entirely, but yes, I don't think you were able to see what we put up. I will put it back on the screen here for you. So this, I'm not sure if you were on, but essentially this definition we came to as a proposal for you all to workshop after talking with some experts in the field, looking at specific agencies' policies or definitions as well, because some of them don't have definitions. And we came to this based on feedback from the experts and based on positives from the ones that we saw and negatives as in parts that were missing that we know from best practices should be included in a definition. So this is what we have. Board member Swing specifically mentioned that he would remove this part because those are also violations of law, rule, regulations, potentially criminal conduct. So it would be redundant to have each of those, but that was, I don't know that the subcommittee has decided on this particular definition. We could always, you all could take a vote if you wanted to on this definition. Someone would have to motion that so that everybody knows what they're voting on.
I think as a subcommittee, we could figure this out and bring our recommendation to the full board.
Right.
And so let's see if we can't present to the board a definition that we agree upon. I agree. Too much wordiness or simple is best. Just making sure we're thorough, capture things. So I heard that part, Chief. I heard what you said. and I was in agreement with simplifying it. Anyone else?
Board Member Kennedy, are you motioning to this definition to approve it?
No, I am just seeing if we as a committee can come up, can agree on a definition that we can present to the board.
Yeah.
I'm gonna just edit it so you can see what it will look like without that language.
I would also agree that if there's anything that is repetitive that's already stated in the violation of law or rules and regulations, that we can remove it. But if there's anything that is not clear that we need to make sure that we highlight, that we should add it back into the definition. But if it's like everything's actually covered, then I think it should be fine just the way. I do also like less wording, but as comprehensive as possible. I'm okay with the second with bullet B as the way it is.
Chief, my question would be on the law enforcement side of things, officers are trained and know what they should not do. On the community side, would those words, misconduct, abuse, or discriminatory behavior, would that give the community a better sense of, and maybe even direction on what their complaint should be?
That's a fair question. And I don't know. Dominique, when you talked about other agencies and how you incorporated wording from other agencies, was that sentence or those words taken from, like, were they taken from somewhere, or were those just?
It was sort of a combination. So, for example, Newark specifically lists some things. Other agencies specifically list some things. But the question I think that Board Member Kennedy raised about whether the community members would know or would that help them understand maybe what some of these complaints could be is a good one, because I think that part of the best practice recommendations too is to inform community members of what those are, because each agency labels their complaints different ways, and a community member may not know what that means, what kind of behavior falls into that category. But it was sort of bringing these together from different types of definitions.
Sure. If you can scroll back up to the National Association on Civilian Law Enforcement Oversight.
Yeah.
Thank you. I mean, that's really pretty much what we're putting up there now in A, in that even that association, which obviously is a proponent for civilian oversight of law enforcement, it speaks to allegations of proven true and represent misconduct under the department's policies and procedures. It doesn't even mention criminal violations of law. So I think that really makes it pretty concise, similar to what we have just done by taking out the discriminatory behavior, misconduct, etc.
My only comment to that is the more we educate, the more we have honest, open, and transparent conversation both ways, both sides, the better we're going to get along as community and law enforcement. And I just don't know any police officers that are getting up going out to do these negative things. We do know we have a few bad apples, but not most of our officers are going out to do this stuff. So I'm not sure they would have a fear of those things being listed, and that would be a concern. Or would there be a fear of those things being listed to in some way on the law enforcement side.
A concern that those words were included in the definition of complaint?
Right.
I can't speak for the profession. I just, like I was saying, I just think that it's redundant, and I'm supportive of a more concise definition.
Right. Okay, I got you.
I will say that in our research, of course, less is more often, but we have seen, again, with the issue of classification of complaints, that sometimes not detailing that something is a part of a civilian complaint means it won't be investigated or classified as a complaint. So we included all of these to ensure that we are encompassing everything. Because right now, if we remove all of that stuff, we have criminal conduct, which, a civilian should be able to file a complaint about. We have violations of laws, rules, and regulations of the agency, but that may not always include things like inappropriate or discourteous conduct. I know that agencies have policies about treating everyone a certain way, but there have been instances where folks do not have their complaint filed as a complaint when they're filing it on discourteous conduct because it's not a violation of policy or law or criminal conduct. So part of including some of these details was to ensure that we are, that agencies will be, keeping all complaints as complaints and investigating them as such.
I was actually.
Go ahead, Wood.
Oh, thank you, sir. I was actually, Dominique, just so it's can be recorded, I was actually going to jump in with the exact same comment. You just beat me to it. It seems to me that the one you just described, inappropriate or discourteous conduct, would not actually be, just as a point of fact, objectively from the language, that would not necessarily be covered under just criminal conduct and violation of any law. So just to note, I think if we take that out, we are actually removing a piece of territory here. It's not just simply redundant. Secondly, I'm kind of on the fence as to whether neglect of duty would be the same, because some of these things are extremely subjective, right? So in whose eyes, right? Like in the eyes of the person filing the complaint, and in the eyes of the community, in the eyes of the police officer. So, and those aren't things that we can predispose with the form, right? We need to make this open so that people are sharing information and being transparent with this stuff. So so it strikes me that some of this could be removed as redundant, but other aspects I don't think would be covered. But I'll yield to the lawyers in the room in terms of the specifics there. I just wanted to make the point.
Just as a point, where I see it being redundant is in the second part of that, is the rules and regulations. Misconduct, dereliction, and neglect of duty is a violation of rules and regulations, department policies and procedures. That's just to clarify, that's where the redundancy comes in.
Sorry, I just want to make sure I understood that. So you would amend it to say violation of any law or department policies and procedures?
That could be, or rules and regulations is one and the same. Department policy procedures would also apply.
Okay, I'm redlining.
We're writing this for the community, correct?
Yes, this would be for both the community and law enforcement. So it would be recommendation to the legislator to include this in the penal code so that each agency across the state will have this definition when they are receiving complaints to then decide, when they get investigated or how. But it would be also outward facing where members of the public would know, okay, this is what makes a civilian complaint, because they're supposed to be informed of the procedure.
And quickly, I don't think Chief Swing was asking to remove rules and regulations. I think what he was saying is that and correct me if I'm wrong, Chief, I think what he was saying is that he sees that inappropriate and discourteous conduct would be covered under rules and regulations of the department. Is that correct? And I understand that. My only concern there, a point taken, my only concern there is that, first of all, I'm unaware of how just personally of how consistent those policies are from department to department. And I'm also just a little concerned in terms of like, and I don't know this, I'm not making this as an accusation, but what if, frankly, one of those departments' definitions of such is just garbage, and frankly does not capture any range of activities that members of the community, even if the department does not, members of the community find quite inappropriate. So that's my only concern with that piece. I get it otherwise, but again, like Mr. Kennedy had just mentioned, since this is a community-facing document, it really needs to be about really informing them, and again, like making sure that we're collecting as a state the information that we want to collect from them. So that's the only reason why I share that. But I don't want to die on this hill or anything. I don't over small details. But that was just why I was kind of curious.
Members have comments on, let's just say, including all the language. Anyone have comments on including all the language?
Chief, you also brought up about internal and external. You want to tell them about, yeah, because some of this can be internal complaints and some of this can be external.
That was more under section B, about an officer discovers conduct by another officer that could be the basis of a complaint. The officer should submit a complaint. Candidly, I would say that language could be stronger, maybe should be stronger, and say an officer shall report that behavior to a supervisor. But that's because the submitting of a complaint internally is done through the chain of command, as opposed to filing a formal complaint in that way. So that should be a shall.
I think you're onto something, Chief. We're talking about officers being more front and forward in making sure people are safe and being willing to speak up and not being complicit in unlawful activities. So you are making a very sound suggestion. I agree. We should change that to shall. So it's a requirement, not just an option. Anyone else?
I want to jump in here. We're at 1:45 right now, and we want to make sure to leave room for public comment. But I want to make sure that it's clear to members of the public what you all are going to recommend to move forward to the board. And I don't know if anyone has, I gave my sort of synopsis of what I thought you all agreed on or talked about, but I don't know if somebody else wants to give potential language to the motion that they would put out for vote to move this to the full board as far as recommending definition and other improvements to the penal code through a letter to the legislature. And at the full board, you will have an opportunity to discuss this again in detail and get feedback from others in the board about this. And we can take this amended definition.
Yeah, I
Dominic,
think
I agree. Take it to the full board. Let us all look at it again.
but I want us to, as a subcommittee, to really bring something to the board, and if they have questions about it, because that's our work as a subcommittee, to bring solutions to the board and not a whole bunch of discussion. I mean, discussion is important, but I think we could agree. I think we could hammer this out really quick, and perhaps with the change of the word should to shall, I like to see if we are ready to vote on this.
Let me
So if that's
Just
a
change this
formal
one.
motion to vote, Pastor Kennedy, are you making a formal motion to
Well,
vote?
I want to make a formal motion, but I don't want to exclude anyone in making comments before we.
Oh,
So we will, so you can make a formal motion just so it's clear on what you all will be voting for. We would then take public comment, and then if someone would like to make, if you'd like to move to push this forward to the full board and someone seconds that, you can then take a public comment to see if you all have any amendments that you'd like to make before actually taking a vote on this. You can also, sorry, I was just going to say, you can also choose to take public comment and then have your formal vote. We just want to allow for the public comment before you all take your final vote. That's all. So you can also, you can either make a motion now or you can choose to take public comment and then you can all vote, make a motion and vote based on your, based on the public comments and your discussion.
I'm open either way. What about the rest of you?
I think I would like to have public comment before we make the motion to vote.
Okay,
And I would
let's
like
do
to
it.
hear public comments too.
Very good.
Great, let's do that.
So since there's no co-chair, because right now, so I can help lead the public comment. So why don't we, if you would like to make a comment, you can either, if you are on Blue Jeans, you can go to the People tab at the top and then scroll all the way to the bottom to use the raise hand function. You can also, we will go to make sure that those folks who are on the phone can also have the opportunity to make public comments. So we will go in the order of region. And so why don't we, I see a raised hand from Michelle Wittig and I see a video. Mr. Hilton, if you could please wait until we can get you next. So if everyone could please stay muted, but if you are giving your public comment, feel free to unmute your video as well as your audio. So first we will go with Michelle Wittig. Thank you, Michelle.
Oh, thank you. Can you hear me? Yes, can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, we can.
Oh, good. Okay, great. Thanks. Yeah, I think the task before the committee at this point is to find a wording that will allow for complaints to be filed by the public or by an officer against an officer for what they perceive to be inappropriate, discriminatory, discourteous, or other forms of misconduct. It's not necessary for the form to eliminate all forms of complaint which would not be judged by a lawyer to be criminal. That it would be an extremely high bar for even accepting a complaint. I don't think that the RIPA board's mandate was intended to limit complaints in that way relative to the types of complaints that are currently being accepted. I put in the chat just a brief non-hypothetical. I observed and heard a racial